I thought it was interesting listening to David speaking about buying a Hoover. And a couple of years back, I spent a day with James Dyson in the Dyson headquarters in a place called Malmesbury in England. And the one thing that causes him sleepless nights and the one thing that causes him to fly into a rage is people referencing his products as a Hoover. He absolutely hates it because he likes to call them Dysons. And I'm sure the people at Miele and all the other brands are the same. Another thing that struck me about what David was speaking about was his reference to the pharmacy, Lloyd's. And I think sometimes when you talk about Irish retail, you have to point to the flaws and you have to point to the things that people are getting wrong. And whilst there's a lot of optimism in the room, and while Rachel's speech was very upbeat and impassioned, and she deserves a huge amount of credit, I think sometimes the job of somebody like me is to puncture people's bubbles and say, hang on a second, all is not well in this particular sector. And it struck me when he was talking about the pharmacy sector because it's an area where, in many ways, you've got a really captive audience for a huge amount of time. Because what happens is, you walk into a pharmacy, and we've all done it, you hand in a prescription, and you wait for 5 minutes or 10 minutes, depending on how long the queue is, and depending on how many pharmacies are ahead of you. And during that 10-minute spell, you are an absolutely captive consumer. You can't go anywhere, you can't do anything. And what's very striking to me sometimes, and sometimes I just stand in a shop and watch, if I'm in there getting a prescription anyway, is how little there is for the consumer in that shop, how little upselling there is, how little there is to engage a consumer in an awful lot of Irish pharmacies, despite the fact that if pharmacies were a little bit more imaginative about how they were doing their business, they could probably sell an awful lot more products that way. And the other thing that I thought when I was listening to Rachel was the fact that she's called the Arboretum. And the first time I ever heard the word Arboretum was on The Simpsons. And there was a big setup, and it was Arboretum, the tree place, because they had to explain to people what it was. That's neither here nor there. And similarly, the picture of the children with the donkey is entirely irrelevant, but I just thought I'd put it there for my own amusement. Now, this is a cutting from the Cork Examiner, as it was known back in the early 1980s. And I have it here because I think it has a message, albeit in a completely unintended message. Now, this was a clipping from the day after Apple opened its first plant in Cork. And I'll just read you the intro. Now, I won't be able to read the intro without drawing breath because it's incredibly long, but I'll do my best. 5 years ago, 5 years from now, Irish housewives could be throwing away the cookery books and taking their recipes off screens of mini computers, and family doctors will be storing their patient histories in the same way, according to a 25-year-old American university graduate who has revolutionized the computer industry. Now, that computer graduate was Steve Jobs. But what's striking about it is how limited the imagination of the author of that piece was. That they could only imagine housewives, incidentally not men but women, storing recipes on computers and doctors storing patient files. And when you think how far the computer industry has travelled since the early 1990s, I think it's a reflection of our world. This is another quite a different clipping from a newspaper. Worldwide what? Computer web to change millions of lives. Yeah, right. Now, the idea behind this clip, the notion is this is the Sun newspaper reporting on the World Wide Web when it was invented and publicised by Tim Berners-Lee. And of course, you can almost sense you can see the sarcasm dripping from the sub-editor's computer as he adds the additional yeah, right. And what's interesting about it is how little we knew about the impact the World Wide Web was going to have on all our lives when it was invented around just over 25 years ago. And I'd like to say, the thing is, I'd like to tell you that's a real front page from the Sun. But of course, it isn't a real front page from the Sun, because the very notion that the Sun would have covered the invention of the World Wide Web is just farcical. In fact, the very notion that any newspaper in the world covered the invention of the World Wide Web back when it was first publicised would be farcical. Because I've looked up the Irish Times archive, there was no reference to it for a very long time after it was created. And the reason why I have those two slides is because it shows you how people in authority and people with voices and people with platforms and people who claim to have knowledge really have very limited knowledge. So that's the caveat that I stand in front of you with. Like, I will talk to you about where I think retail is going and what I think you should do to improve your chances of surviving in what is going to be a very, very difficult world for all retailers in this country and indeed beyond this country over the next 10 or 15 years. But our knowledge is limited. We don't have all the answers. But our world, the world we all live in, has moved from this to this in the last 30 years. Now, this picture here is a picture of a New York subway in the late 1950s, and a couple of things have always struck me about it when I see it. First, there's three things about the picture that strike me, actually. There's the fact that almost everybody in the railway carriage is reading a newspaper. Almost everybody in the railway carriage is wearing a hat. And there's one other thing that strikes me about the railway carriage of the 1950s. Almost everyone in the railway carriage is male. But now you look at the 21st century, and this is what we're like. Same subway, New York City, except this is New York City subway in 2017. The demographic has completely shifted. The hats are gone, sadly, because I think I'd look great in a hat, but there you go, it's not to be. And everybody is staring into their mobile phone. And if you look around you, in any public space in Ireland, that's what you see. People are staring into their mobile phones. Although I do sometimes think it's funny when you hear people saying, oh, remember the good old days when people used to take in the world around them and they used to chat to their fellow man while they were in public transport. This is what they were doing. They were looking at newspapers. They weren't actually taking in the world. So it's not so much that our world, it's not so much our approach has changed, it's just that the technology has changed. And that's an important thing for the retail space as well. So retail has gone from, I picked 4 random slides of retail. Now, I'm not going to lie, they don't really reflect the retail experience of my childhood, but I thought they were kind of cute. One of them does. So you have three old school Irish shops that used to sell, they used to sell beer, they used to sell weed killer, they used to sell groceries, all those things, kind of cute. And then there's Logue's shoe shop in Galway, which I just put in there because that was the place I got my first pair of shoes a very, very long time ago. And of course, this is the retail space now, and we all know that. So you have your ASOS's, and you have your Amazons, and you have your Prime, which is yet to come to this country, but it will. Then you've got your small little artisan producers who are selling on platforms like Etsy, and you've got people buying on eBay. And you've got this incredible retail revolution, the like of which we have never seen in the history of mankind, and everybody is struggling to come to terms with what it means. And here's some numbers that should be both a cause of optimism for the retail space and a cause of grave pessimism. Retail sales are up 7% to 40 billion. This is last year. So 40 billion euros, 7% bounce, was a level not recorded since the very height of the boom. And disposable incomes have climbed dramatically as well. They were up by 5% last year to 102 billion. That's the highest level they've ever been at. And the next slide, or the next point, is probably the one that should be troubling everyone in the room. 5 billion euros was spent online by Irish consumers last year, and 3 billion of that went overseas. Now, imagine if you just sucked that much money out of the economy, out of any enterprise, out of any economy. It would be very difficult for people to survive, and that's the reality. 80% of Irish retailers have no e-commerce functionality, and this next one, I think, is probably the most depressing point on that particular slide. 22% of Irish retailers haven't got any web presence at all. Now, that's according to figures from Retail Excellence Ireland, by the way. It's not something I've just plucked out at the top of my hat, which I don't have, sadly. 22% of Irish retailers don't have a web presence at all. Now, what that would tell me is that 22% of Irish retailers won't exist in 10 years' time. And I take issue with some of the things that some of the umbrella groups and lobby groups and representative groups for the Irish retail sector say. I take issue with the fact that they're calling for governmental support and state assistance to invest in websites and to invest in a web presence, because I don't think that's the answer. I think for retailers to survive, retailers have to do exactly what Rachel has done and what other they have to reimagine the world in which they live. And I think too many people in that space, and I see it all the time in my day-to-day job, too many of those people are really reluctant to reimagine that space. This is one company that isn't and has never been reluctant to reimagine the space. Now, I don't know how many of you would be familiar with Kenny's bookshop in Galway. I'm from Galway, which is why I would have a personal attachment to that shop. Now, Kenny's is one of, and has been one of the most long-standing retailers in Galway City. It was going for decades and decades before I was born, and it sells books, first editions, it sells art, it sells a whole lot of stuff, and it was an absolutely key part of the Galway retail landscape. At least it was, until it shut down its shop and it moved everything into the online space. And one of the reasons why Kenny's have done so well in the online space is that Kenny's were one of the very first retailers in Ireland to have an online presence. Back in 1996, when I worked for the Connacht Tribune newspaper, I remember writing about Kenny's and the fact that they had an online presence. And what was funny was how many people laughed at them and how many people thought they were just wasting their time and effort and wasting their money. But Kenny's is now a surviving and thriving business, albeit not the kind of business that it once was, but it is still alive. And I think that there's a lot to be said for surviving. You might have to change, you might have to modify, you might have to completely reinvent yourself, but that's what people have to do. And this is Kenny's today. They have a huge online delivery service. And I spoke to Conor Kenny, who's the MD of the company, last week, because I was writing a piece for the Irish Times about the death of Irish retail. And I know that's a very gloomy title, but that's the reality in which I think we're living. And he told me about the challenges that the retailer, the traditional retailer, and the clicks and mortar retailer faces in Ireland. And one of the big things is the logistical problem of getting product delivered at a low cost. And that's something that could probably be addressed by the state. I mentioned the fact that 22% of, or nearly, let me go back to, I mentioned the fact that 80% of Irish retailers don't have an e-commerce facility on their website. This is one of them. Now, Penneys is obviously a huge, huge organisation, multi-billion euro company that has operations all over Europe and most recently in the United States. But the one thing you can't do on Penneys or Primark is you can't buy any product. Penneys doesn't have a transactional website. Now, you would imagine a company that is this powerful and has that much money would be falling over itself to have a transactional website. But what Penneys has decided to do is, no, they don't want to do that. And they've taken a very good commercial decision that works for them. So they've said, okay, our product is too cheap, and the people who buy our product are so mercurial, they change their mind so frequently that if we were to start selling huge volumes of our clothes in the online space, we would be dealing with huge volumes of returns every single day. So they said, no, we're not going to do that. We're not going to bother because it's just too much hassle for them. But what they did was they didn't turn their back on the online space, which is what some organizations might have done if they'd lacked the vision and the imagination. What they did instead was they took over the online spaces where their shoppers exist. So they know that they've got a traditionally young demographic, traditionally female, so they have a huge web presence on Instagram, on Snapchat, on Twitter, and on Facebook. And it is driving business into their shops. So they haven't just buried their heads in the sand or tried to hold back the tide like King Canute. They have said, okay, we're going to do the online thing differently to other retailers. Dunnes Stores is another retailer who's taken a very different approach, and David mentioned it. He didn't mention Dunnes, but he mentioned an approach that retailers have to take. Now, if you go into a Dunnes Stores now, it's very different to the Dunnes Stores of my childhood. One of the first jobs I ever had as a teenager was working in Dunnes Stores, and back then in the late 1980s, it was very much a stack 'em high and sell 'em cheap kind of store. The products they sold were, they were fairly basic. There was loads of them, and it was like going into a jumble sale almost every single day, because once 10 o'clock in the morning came along, the clothes were thrown all over the place, and it was a really unpleasant shopping experience. But Dunnes Stores in the last 4 or 5 years has completely reinvented what it is as a business. So it has a huge transactional website, and it has completely stripped its stores of stock. So when you go into a Dunnes Stores now, particularly one of the bigger, more modern Dunnes Stores, it's actually a very pleasant shopping experience. You can see the clothes handily enough. They've done deals with various eclectic designers, and it becomes much more pleasant to be in the shops. And they don't care in Dunnes Stores. They don't give a rashers if people walk out of their shops without a bag in their hands. That doesn't matter to them, because what they know is that people will go into Dunnes Stores, they'll browse, they'll go for coffee in the centre of the shop, they'll have the communal experience that people talk about when they talk about retail and shopping, and then they'll go home and they'll buy the product on the website. And that's what Dunnes Stores has decided to do, and that is why Dunnes Stores is a really strong and powerful force in the online retail space in Ireland today. And they could have made a completely different decision. They could have gone down the pennies route. They could have stuck with the stack 'em high and sell 'em cheap model. Or they could have turned their back on the online retail revolution. But no, they've embraced it and they have done it really well, and they deserve a lot of credit for that. Now, one of the things that I was asked to do was to talk about what Irish consumers want. Now, I refer back to the opening slide about the guy imagining that Steve Jobs, the Apple computer would be used to store housewives' recipes. I don't know. I'm no oracle. I can't say for sure what consumers want. But just given my experience over the last 15 years, and I'm sure lots of you don't know what that experience is, but I'm the consumer affairs correspondent to the Irish Times, and over the last 15 years, I have dealt with Irish retailers, big retailers, small retailers. I've handled thousands of complaints from consumers about Irish retailers, and I think I've got a good idea about what people are looking for in the retail space in Ireland. So we want better service, and we want to be in control of that service. Now that can be in the online space or it can be offline. We want things to be reliable, and if things go wrong, we want help. And I've seen that more and more and more and more and more in recent times. And this is something that gives Irish retailers, small Irish retailers, medium-sized Irish retailers, a huge advantage over the internet giants that they're competing with. Because let's face it, you can't compete with the likes of Amazon on price if you're selling certain products. It just can't be done. But you try ringing Amazon if you have a problem with a product. It's a nightmare. You can't contact them. And the same can be said for all of the giant online retailers that operate in that space. One of the things that Conor Kenny of Kenny's told me was they're a bookseller, they're competing with Amazon. Yet one of the things that their consumers say to them over and over and over and over again is, we love the fact that we can pick up the phone and call Kenny's. If they want to ask a question, if they want to talk about a particular order. So that gives the Irish retailer, the small Irish retailer, a huge advantage that the big giants don't have. We want help, and we want to know that there are human beings looking after us and that they care about us. We want you to answer the phone if we ring, because Lord knows everyone in the room hates the automated answering machines that you have to deal with when you're dealing with big companies. We want you to solve any problems that we have, and we want value, and we don't really want to have to work at it. I started doing the Price Watch column in the Irish Times in 2003, 2004. So I've kind of charted the course of the boom, the bust, and arguably the boom again over the last 15 years. And one of the constant things is that Irish consumers across the board have become way more savvy and way more determined to get good value for money. And one of the things that really, really drives people mad is the notion that they're being ripped off. And they can be ripped off by a big retailer, a small retailer. So people want value for money and they don't want to have to work too hard at it. I think you mentioned, Rachel, the whole notion of the experiential. And that's obviously, you all know this, that's the buzzword in retail at the moment. And it's what, if you do it well, it's an exceptional way of making a business not only survive but thrive. There's two examples here. One is on one of those pictures you see the petrol station of my childhood, which had all these like really rusty old petrol pumps. There was a garage forecourt there, and there was always the most disgusting toilet in the world somewhere out the back that as a small child you'd be sent into, and it was just a nightmare. And you compare the petrol stations of the 1970s, 80s and 90s with the petrol stations of today, and they are just worlds apart. Look at the Barack Obama Plaza. I mean, you go in there, you can get hot food. It's all these shiny glass palaces of commerce. There's stuff you can buy. It's somewhere that you could quite reasonably spend a few minutes of your day without being absolutely disgusted, because they have created an experience. Pennies, I've mentioned already, they've moved into this space in a big way. And what they've done, and anybody who's gone into a big Pennies has seen this, they're offering nail bars, they're offering people various different treatments. So people will go into the shops, get something done, and then they might buy a product. Another retailer that does it extremely well is Avoca, and Avoca were one of the first big retail chains in Ireland to discover the benefits of the experiential shopping experience, and they did it a long time ago. I see that Arnott's in Dublin is now offering people haircuts or hairstyling in the shops, and not every retailer is going to be able to do that. Not every retailer is going to going to be able to offer some kind of life-affirming experience in the shop. But every retailer should at least think of ways they can make the experience of somebody walking through their doors more pleasurable. And they can look for ways that they can encourage the would-be shopper to walk through their doors, even if they're not going to spend any money. I remember speaking to one of the senior people in Avoca about 3 or 4 months ago, and one of the stories that he told me was kind of interesting, because Avoca is not a cheap shop. Anyone who's ever been there, you know it's a high-priced shop. And during the boom year, during the bust, if you were to look at a retailer that would be really challenged by the absolute decimation of Irish disposable income, you would have said, okay, well, Avoca's going to struggle, because how could they not? People don't have the money to spend on their relatively high-priced products. But Avoca actually did really well, because what they did that an awful lot of other retailers who were operating in that space, and an awful lot of other retailers who were operating in, the main streets or high streets or whatever. In fact, that's just, by the way, that's one of the real bugbears of my life, that we don't have a phrase for that. If you call it high street, you sound like you're in the UK. If you call it main street, you sound like you're in the United States. I think we need a different phrase for that in Ireland. If anyone has any ideas, I'd love to hear it. But what they had discovered in Avoca was that the simple act of selling the fresh coffee and the buns and the donuts and whatever it might be, people would come into Avoca not because they were afraid they'd have to go in and spend money on the credit cards or rack up debt that they didn't want to. They were just going in for an afternoon out. They weren't planning to spend any money, and any money they did spend was kind of a bonus. The thing that strikes me as a reporter and as somebody whose job it is to challenge customer focused businesses, be they shops, mobile phone operators, banks, is how terrible people are at customer service in Ireland a lot of the time. And I just can't get my head around it, because the making of a customer happy should be the be-all and the end-all of all retailing. Because if you've got a happy customer, they're going to return to you. It is the single biggest indicator of customer loyalty. If people have a good experience in your shop, they will return. It's important because it acts as a key point of differentiation. It makes you different from the big online retailers that you can't challenge on price. The more happy customers you have, the less customer churn there'll be, the more they'll spend, the less negative word of mouth that you'll get. And the reality is, we all know this, it's cheaper to hang on to the customers that you have than to advertise to new customers and try and get them in through your doors. One of the things that it's always good to get a look at what people want and what Irish consumers want, because we change, we evolve, we're very different today, and we have very different expectations as consumers today than we had 20 years ago. So this is a piece of research from Accenture, and it shows that we are, and you probably know this, both from your business dealings and from your day-to-day personal life, we're way more impatient than we ever were. We're mobile, we're social, and we're an awful lot harder to impress than we were in the past. 9 out of 10 Irish consumers use online channels when evaluating providers. So people will look stuff up. And what we want as consumers from retailers and from service providers across the board is speed, knowledgeable employees, and a customised experience, something that is for us. 2/3 of people say that they won't switch provider, or 2/3 say they have switched provider because the service wasn't up to scratch. Now, there's a very alarming statistic that's coming down the tracks, and a lot of this was focused on service providers such as mobile phone companies, utilities, those kind of things. But the same things hold true across the entire retail sector. 90% share horror stories with at least one person. That's a huge amount. So if something goes wrong in your shop, 90% of people are going to tell people about it. And of course, given the world in which we live, an awful lot of people are going to take to social media and they're going to post horror stories online, and that is not what you want. But the terrible, frightening statistic is the one there that isn't in bold. So the second last point. When faced with substandard customer service, 53% of Irish consumers stop engaging immediately. That means that more than half the people who have a negative experience in the Irish retail space won't even complain to the retailer. They'll just never go back. So you have no opportunity to make amends. You have no opportunity to redress the situation, but you've lost that business. Because one of the things that we in Ireland are terrible at is complaining. Like, we like to complain when we get home, and we love to complain on Facebook, but and I'm like this myself, unless a waiter actually spits in my soup in front of me, when they come down to take away the plate of half-eaten food, and I will say, oh no, it's grand, because I don't want to make a scene. We don't like to make a scene in Ireland. We don't like to complain. But what I would do, if the food is manky in a restaurant, is I'll just never go back to it, and that is a terrifying thing. So you've got to work out ways to differentiate yourself. You're more reliable, you're more familiar, you're more trusted, you're more long-standing, and one of the key ones, you care more about your business, you care more about your customers. And all retailers, big and small, who operate in this country should make that the imperative. You want your shoppers to know that you care. And I have hundreds of stories from readers of the Irish Times or listeners to the Ray D'Arcy show or whatever it might be who've contacted me, and the common thread that knits almost all of these things is how apathetic and how much the retailers didn't care about a person's problem. And I'll talk to you about exactly how that plays out in a second. Now, there's just 4 very well-known Irish brands. So, which of those 2 brands on the very top, the 2 airlines? You've got Aer Lingus and Ryanair. Who's the most complained about? Anyone hazard a guess? Yeah, that's what you think. But I can tell you by a factor of about 10 to 1, Aer Lingus I get more complaints about Aer Lingus than I get about Ryanair. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One, Ryanair tend to be quite good at the basics of flying, and that's why they're the biggest airline in Europe. They don't tend to lose your bags, and the reason why they don't tend to lose your bags is losing your bags costs them money. And I remember once I spent a day with Ryanair, and every single morning there's a conference call between Ryanair executives and all of the airports that Ryanair services across Europe. And it's a bit like the Eurovision, except without the crack, because they'll dial into Malmo, and the guy who operates the Ryanair services in Malmo will say, yeah, we had 10 flights yesterday, 3 were late, and we lost 4 bags. And you can almost feel, it's almost like the guy from Malmo, who's probably a very highly trained, qualified professional, it's like he's a schoolboy reporting to the teacher. And the Ryanair executives will go through them for a shortcut for losing the 4 bags. And it's that kind of weird micromanagement that really works for the airline. And as a result, if part of your day was to get on the phone to Michael O'Leary at 8 o'clock in the morning and tell him you lost 5 bags and 3 of the planes that you were due to get out were late, you'd probably make sure you didn't lose the bags. So that's one reason why I get so few complaints about Ryanair. But the other reason is Ryanair has been exceptionally good at managing expectations. So we all know that when you fly Ryanair, you're not expecting the 4-star service that Aer Lingus promises, although I've never really understood what the 4-star service that Aer Lingus promise is. They have much lower expectations than they do when they're flying Aer Lingus. So when Aer Lingus gets things wrong, people are way more likely to complain, way more likely to give out. And that's one of the reasons why I get so many more complaints about Aer Lingus. The other one, Vodafone and Air, 2 big operators. Most complained about company? It's Air, by a massive margin. And again, what's interesting about that is both Air and Aer Lingus are the 2 indigenous operators who've been in the space for the longest time, and both of those seem to too frequently take their foot off the pedal. I want to just talk, because as I say, some of you will know what I do as part of my job, which is to look after consumer complaints and queries. Some of you won't, but now I've told you, so you all do. But I want to talk about the anatomy of a complaint, what they look like, because the thing is, almost every single complaint I get about retailers, about banks, about airlines, whatever, they're almost all identical. Mary will sign up to a service, or Mary will buy a product. The service or the product will let Mary down, so Mary will get in touch with the service, or she'll go into the shop. She wrestles with an automated answering machine, maybe if it's a phone thing, and she'll listen to hold music, and then she'll talk to a human being, and the human being will be useless. So Mary's problem will persist, and then Mary will contact the company again, and she will do it again and again and again and again and again. And eventually, Mary contacts me, I contact the company, and within hours, the problem is resolved. Now, that's not because I have any special superpowers or I'm particularly good at anything, but it's because companies, big and small, are terrified of bad press. And it really upsets me that somebody can be just driven to complete distraction by a business or a retailer that doesn't care. And then as soon as the newspaper contacts them, the problem gets fixed. It doesn't have to be like that. And that's why I think when you're customer focused and when you're dealing with consumers every single day, the primary thing is always, are the people who are leaving my shop leaving it happier than when they came in? And if they're not, well then frankly you're failing. So a couple of weeks back I wrote a piece about how businesses like yours could not get onto the pages of the Irish Times and could not feature in the Price Watch section. And like, one of the things I feel acute, I kind of feel bad because sometimes when I ring shops, like typically smaller shops, sometimes I ring them, they're kind of initially delighted to hear from me because, oh look, the Irish Times is calling, and they're going, yeah, I've got really bad news. You've let down Mary. And I explain the problem. So these are the tips that you can use to never appear in the Price Watch page as a retailer. 1, reward and empower your frontline staff. Far too often the people who are working on the shop floor, or far too often the people who are answering the phones for your business, are the ones who are the least best paid and the ones who are treated worst. I'm not saying anybody in this room is guilty of that, but it is you see it all the time. You want your staff, the people who are dealing with customers all the time, to be positive, upbeat, and to actually like working for you. And you can only do that by rewarding them. That's not necessarily by paying them 3 times minimum wage, but it's just by making them feel like valued members of your team. If you rip people off, people are going to be upset. We all know that. If you answer the phone, or no, answer your phone. Don't let it ring and forever and ever and ever. Don't make promises that you can't or won't keep, because again, people say they promise you the earth, moon and stars. You go home and you don't have the earth, moon and stars, so you're going to complain. Don't ignore correspondence. Treat all complaints seriously. Set targets, customer improvement targets for all your staff. And if you're getting positive feedback from people, then you know you're meeting those targets. Keep all the channels of communication open. Learn how to manage irrationally angry customers. Because believe me, I see this all the time, and I'm sure you see this all the time if you're working in the retail space. Sometimes there's that notion that the customer's always right. Sometimes they're just wrong. And we all know that. In some sense, they come screaming into the shop because they believe they've been mistreated, and you're now compounding that mistreatment. But you still have to manage the irrationally angry customers well, and it's funny how a lot of the time that doesn't happen. So you have to be flexible and gracious, and you have to use common sense. And by the way, the last one of those, which isn't, I haven't got it in, because according to BuzzFeed, one of the defining websites that creates listicles, you should never have a list that's an even number. You should always have an odd number. So I stopped at 11, but the 12th one would always be, and it applies to all retail space, be sound, because businesses that are sound do well, businesses that are not sound struggle. The 22, I want to go back to the 22%, because that's the most damning number that I referenced at the very beginning. And that's the 22% of Irish retailers who don't have any web presence at all. And they're the 22% who may not be in business in 5 years' time. And I take issue with what a lot of the lobby groups and umbrella groups say about needing government support, and I appreciate all the efforts that the local enterprise office here is doing, and it's a good thing that local communities are working out ways to develop and enhance the profile and the businesses of local businesses, because they employ a lot of people, they generate money in the local economy, and it really does matter. And we talk an awful lot, in fact we probably talk too much in Ireland about the drive to the online space, but one of the things that, and it's the thing I say on my soapbox, that people always think, okay, you do the Price Watch thing, you must be exclusively driven by better value for money and by cheaper products, and that's not true at all. I think we all as consumers and citizens have a moral responsibility to shop in our local communities, because if we don't, our local communities are going to break down, and our high streets / main streets / whatever you've come up with are going to change, and we'll all be the poorer for that. But the 22% say, the 22% say, oh, I can't go online, oh, I'm technophobic, oh, I don't like technology, oh, I don't have the money to do it. And the reality is that getting online costs absolutely nothing in Ireland. Absolutely nothing. Anybody in the room who doesn't have an online presence can go home today and they can have an online presence that looks quite swanky by midnight tonight at 0 cost. And that's what you need to remember. You just need to do it. And I'm talking about setting up your Twitter account, setting up your Instagram account, setting up your Facebook account, your Snapchat account, and downloading something as simple as WordPress and putting together a cheap as chips blog for your website that will allow you to tell the story of your business. Now, if you don't do that, and if you continue to persist in saying, okay, so why would my business have an online presence? Well then, in 5 years' time when you don't exist, you'll kind of know why. Because you have to talk to your audience in the places that your audience are, and right now that's in the online space. And I want to talk a little bit about why it matters, why social media matters to you, and why it matters to, well, broader, but more specifically to you. It's a great way of distributing news and information. It's also where everything that I can think of in terms of breaking news or events or global disasters happens first. And obviously we're living in this absolutely insane world where Donald Trump is tweeting US policy in real time without telling any of his policymakers what he's doing. And some days he'll tweet something and then another day he'll tweet something that's completely contrary. But almost every piece of news unfolds first on social media. And my favourite example of it is about 4 years ago, Pope Benedict XVI announced his intention to resign from the papacy. Hadn't been done for 800 years. It was an absolutely earth-shattering event. But the way the story unfolded is very telling of the 21st century, because every single month, the Pope, whoever the Pope might be, comes into a room in the Vatican, and he's flanked by 4 cardinals on either side of him, and he sits down and he reads out a statement in which he outlines the progress through the saintly process of a number of different people. So he'll say something like, Pope John the 23rd is doing well this month, and Mother Teresa's had a bit of a setback, and Pope John Paul II has had a bounce. And he'll go through about 100 people who are either being beatified or canonized, or there's a few other things that I can't remember. And he delivers the whole thing in Latin, because that's what the Pope does. And he reads it out, and every month there are 3 reporters from the Italian news media sent to cover the event. And it must be so spirit-crushingly dull for all of them, because A, they probably don't speak Latin, and B, they know that they're going to get a soft copy of the release in Italian as soon as the thing ends, so they don't even have to take notes. So they're just sitting there. Except on this one occasion, Pope Benedict read out his thing about the saints, and then at the very end of it he said, also in Latin, by the way, at the end of next month I'm going to resign. Now, one of the people in the room took out their phone, and they texted their boss to say this was going to happen, and then they tweeted, Pope Benedict XVI announces an intention to resign -Enza, which was the name of the news organisation she worked for. 7 minutes later, she left the room, and the tweet had been retweeted 280,000 times, and that's how the story broke. Now, can you just imagine if you're one of the 2 other reporters in the room walking out going, quiet enough now today, nothing going on, and then you find out that the whole world has fallen apart and you missed the big scoop. It's an incredibly powerful marketing tool if it's done well. And there are some businesses in Ireland that use Twitter and Instagram incredibly well when it comes to marketing their products. Somebody in the room earlier on said they had a web presence, and these are for advertising. That's not what you do, because that whole top-down approach to consumer communications is gone. We don't want to be advertised to on social media. We want you to talk to us like real people. So you have a conversation with your customers. You tell the story of your business. You make your business seem unique and special. And everybody can do that. There's a chap who runs a fish restaurant in Donegal called Harry's Shack. I've never been to it, but I feel like I've been to it, because every day he would post pictures of the restaurant, their cooking, him out foraging for wild garlic or whatever it might be, him down at the fish market buying fish. And all he does is he tells the story of the restaurant. And that's what businesses should be looking at doing. Tell the story of your business and you will bring people in. It's also, by the way, you build your brand, you get feedback, both positive and negative, you extend awareness, you spread news, you spy on your competitors, you build loyalty, you engage with people, you sell ideas, and you take people with you on your journey. And like all of the statistics show that if somebody follows you on Twitter, if someone engages with you on Twitter, they're far, far more likely to spend money with you when it comes time to spend money. So the fact that the returns aren't immediate, particularly with, not so much with Facebook, but with Facebook you have to pay money. But with Instagram and with Twitter, the returns aren't immediate, and it can be a slow slog to get up and running. But ultimately, if people are talking to you, they're going to spend money with you. I just want to show you this, because this is a great example of Twitter marketing that you didn't know existed. I'm sure all of you have seen this picture. You've never seen this picture? You probably have, you just don't remember it, because it's actually 3-4 years old, and it was at the Oscar ceremony in 2014. Ellen got everyone to pose for a selfie, so you've got Bradley Cooper, Jennifer Lawrence, you've got, what's the name, Brad Pitt and Kevin Spacey, awkward. And you got all these people posing for the pic, and it became the most widely retweeted tweet of all time. It just went all over the place. And within 24 hours it had been retweeted 3-4 million times. And what nobody knew was that Samsung, the mobile phone operator, had paid $15 million for that tweet. And it was a great piece of viral marketing on their behalf, because they'd given Ellen a Samsung phone. So the phone that was used to take the picture was a Samsung phone. And you think, and what was nice about it is there's no gotcha moment. There's no moment when you realize, oh, it's like it's an ad. But it worked from a marketing perspective, because it was retweeted widely. Then newspapers started picking up on the fact that it was so widely retweeted, and then television programs started showing pictures of the picture being taken, and in every single one of the pictures there was a Samsung phone. So Samsung got a huge pickup on that. But I want to talk, so that's one major way where social media can have a big influence. I'll skip that one because that doesn't really work for you. This is an interesting one. This is a terrible story about a restaurant in Dublin, and they took to this, they had a really good social media presence. Somebody went on and started tweeting negative things to the restaurant. The restaurant came back to them and said, on social media, identify yourself now, we'll come down and give you a box. Threatening to hit your diners is never a good look. I'm going to skip that one. But this is a really terrible story of how social media can go bad. This woman is called Justine. She was a HR executive in New York City. She was hugely successful. I know she was hugely successful because she was able to fly business class from New York to Johannesburg on her holidays. I know she was able to do this because she tweeted. Now, she only had 104 followers, so how would I know? It's because when she got on the plane flying from New York to London, she tweeted that she was flying business class. And she tweeted something along the lines of, you think people in business class would know more about personal hygiene? The German man beside me stinks. And you're going, oh, that's not a very nice thing to say. But again, I don't care, I don't know. Then she got to London, and I know she got to London because she tweeted about it, and she said, you can tell I'm in London because everyone has really terrible teeth. Again, she hit tweet, and it was sent out to her 104 followers. I don't care. But it was the next thing that defined her life for the next 5 years, and arguably defined her life ever since. Because she gets on the plane that's bound from London to Johannesburg. She gets into the business class cabin. The lights dim. They say, would Madam care for a glass of champagne, or whatever it is. The champagne is there. And she tweets this: going to Africa, hope I don't get AIDS. Just kidding, I'm white. Now, it's an appalling thing to say. But she had 104 followers. So only 104 people, maybe 5 of them would have seen what she'd said. So you're kind of thinking, okay, so she seems a bit racist and horrible, but 5 people. Somebody sent it to a journalist who worked for a magazine called Gawker, an online magazine called Gawker. In real time, he tweeted it to his 50,000 followers. They all tweeted about it. And then suddenly somebody tweeted that Justine Sacco was now flying over sub-Saharan Africa and didn't realize that the entire internet was talking about her. And the topic, has Justine landed yet, became the top trending topic on Twitter in the United States and then in the world. And then when poor Justine Sacco landed, she arrived in Johannesburg, TV cameras at arrivals, her hotel was cancelled, she couldn't get a flight home, holiday was destroyed, couldn't get any relationships, lost her job, her whole life fell apart. So, and I'm using that as an example of why you should use social media. I appreciate there's an irony there, but you just need to be careful. And I'm just going to finish. I was going to give you one other stories, but I'm going to give you one example in real time of empowering your staff, treating your staff well in the retail space, and that has a hugely positive benefit. Every week in the Irish Times, I carry gripes and complaints from consumers about various businesses. Every now and then, I get a really good news story. So 2 or 3 weeks ago, I got a story from a woman who was buying her shopping in a Lidl in Dublin just before Christmas. She got to the till. The bill came to €70. She realised she'd left her credit cards and her wallet at home. So she had no money. The woman who was operating the till said, don't worry about it, use my credit card and you can drop the money back into me whenever you get a chance. This woman was so blown away by this act of completely unnecessary kindness that she wrote into the Irish Times. We put the story on our website. 250,000 people read the story. It became the second most read story of the week in the Irish Times, and Little got huge positive responses as a result. Then she was invited onto the Ray D'Arcy show on TV, so the cashier could talk about why she'd done this thing. And the whole point about it was that this woman, her name was Anne, she was happy in her workplace. She felt that she was being treated with respect by her employer. And when the moment came that one of her customers was upset and kind of adrift because she left her wallet at home, she did something that was far above and beyond the call of duty. And that's what you want all of your employees to do. And you can only do that by creating a good, happy workspace where people are proud to work. And that's all I have to say.